knife crime is a problem that really requires a cross-society response.
It's easy to sort of make the assumption that everything is always getting worse, but actually knife crime specifically seems to be falling.
What the government would argue is that this is a real comprehensive approach. This is not just about sort of tackling the symptoms of knife crime. This is not just about policing and enforcement. This is about early prevention.
What else should the government be doing?
If you said to people, CBT is the answer to knife crime, it might not be the first thing that comes to mind.
Hi, I'm Ciaran Thapar and this is the YEFcast. When it was elected in 2024, the Labour government committed to halving knife crime within a decade. It was a bold move. But in the 2 years since then, what steps have they taken? I'm joined by my colleague, Joe Collin, Head of Policy and Guidance at the Youth Endowment Fund. Hi, Joe. Before we get started, can you just explain a bit about your role?
Yeah, hi, Ciaran. As you say, I'm Head of Policy and Guidance here at the Youth Endowment Fund. And so my role is all about, I work with a fantastic team of research managers, and we produce evidence-based guidance, both to practitioners, so police officers, teachers, directors of children's services, but also to policymakers on the changes, evidence-based changes they should make to protect children from involvement in violence, including knife crime.
What approach does the Youth Endowment Fund take towards trying to solve a problem like knife crime?
So the key thing that separates the Youth Endowment Fund from other sort of actors and stakeholders in the system is that at the centre of our approach is evidence. So we look to synthesise the best available evidence from right across the world. And we also run and conduct a lot of our own research. We fund big evaluations of programmes here. We survey thousands of children to really make sure we're bringing the best available evidence to this problem. If we think about other sectors, you'd never deliver a vaccine to a child or a tablet or a therapy to a child in health without making sure it's evidence-based. And we're here to make sure that in the realm of violence reduction, we make sure that every intervention delivered to children is evidence-based.
And the approach that the Youth Endowment Fund take to try and solve violence comes through looking at different sectors. So not just through a policing or enforcement lens, through looking at education, the youth sector. Just talk me through why that is.
Yeah, so I think often when people think about violence reduction and knife crime, their first thought, often quite rightly, goes to policing and the justice system. And how do we enforce and how do we catch offenders and make sure that they're receiving sentences and support that will prevent them from doing so in future. And as part of any strategy to prevent knife crime, policing and justice system, the youth justice system, of course, plays a really critical role. But we also know that knife crime is a problem that really requires a cross-society response. It requires a response from a variety of different sectors, variety of different departments to really tackle the root causes and deliver a variety of early intervention approaches that can prevent violence in the long term. So whether that's education, children's services, the youth sector, the health system, or local violence prevention, these are all sectors that are really critical to preventing involvement in violence. And if we just left it to the police, if we just left it to the justice system, we wouldn't be able to achieve the kind of change that we need, the scale of change that we need to prevent violence and knife crime.
So obviously recently Keir Starmer announced his resignation as Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. But back in 2024, just over 2 years ago, one of the first things that he did as Prime Minister after taking office was to convene a knife crime coalition. Can you tell me a bit about this?
Yeah, so Keir Starmer, right from the election campaign in 2024, made a really sort of clear and personal commitment actually to addressing knife crime. It features really prominently in the manifesto, this mission to halve knife crime by 2034. And I think to really hold himself accountable and to really drive that mission forward, he established in 2024 this coalition to tackle knife crime. And that features a variety of campaigners, a lot of campaigners actually who have close familial personal experience of losing family members and losing children to really just awful and tragic incidents, just really unimaginable incidents of knife crime. And they're joined on the coalition by different charities, frontline practitioners. We're on the coalition as well, and we try and input our sort of evidence base and knowledge of the best available evidence and what we know from children into the coalition. So it gives you a really good combination of expertise. And that coalition has met regularly over the last couple of years to try and inform the government and advise them on the policy options that they're choosing.
It's really valuable to have that spread of voices in the room, ensuring that, you have that personal passion and urgency, which can often be lacking in policy making, but also the ability to be a bit detached and dispassionate and look at trying to solve the problem from a policy angle as well. That combination of those two things has obviously paid dividends, I think, over the last couple of years. So what's the government done since it started this coalition, since it made this commitment?
So the government has really used this mission as a sort of call to action across different government departments to deliver a variety of different policies that look to tackle knife crime and halve it. And very usefully for us, they sort of summarise that approach in their knife crime action plan that published in April. It's actually got a slightly less snappy name. It's called the Protecting Lives, Building Hope plan. And that plan sets out the sort of 4 aims that the government have. And I'm just going to very briefly talk through those 4 aims because we need to understand them understanding them is sort of fundamental to understanding the government's approach. So the first part of the plan, aim 1, is about supporting young people so they get a better start in life. This is all about early prevention. It's all about addressing the root causes of violence and stopping the sort of childhood harms and traumas that can lead to later involvement in knife crime. The second is about risk, and it's all about identifying which children and adults are at particular risk, which areas are at particular risk, how can we provide targeted support there. The third aim is all about policing and enforcement. It's a lot of what you'd expect to see in a high quality knife crime reduction plan. It's all about investment in neighbourhood policing. How do we deliver fairer and more effective stop and search? A lot of the things you'd expect to see. And the fourth is all about how do we stop the cycle of knife crime? How do we provide better support to children and adults who've already offended? How do we make sure they don't reoffend again? How do we reform the youth justice system? And so what the government would argue is that this is a real comprehensive approach. This is not just about sort of tackling the symptoms of knife crime. This is not just about policing and enforcement. This is about early prevention right the way through to high quality policing and enforcement, and then reforming the justice system to reduce reoffending.
Obviously, within that plan, there is work on education and in schools to work with young people to make them feel more safe. That's a particular focus that you have actually taken in your work with us at the YEF. Why this focus in schools, and what does that look like?
Yeah, I mean, I can say personally for me, there's a focus on education. I used to be a secondary history teacher, so very, very passionate about this as an area, but really glad to say, I mean, the government have also taken an approach that really puts education at the heart of a response to knife crime and violence. And it features very prominently in the knife crime action plan. So just to give a couple of really brief examples that speak to 2 sides of the coin here in terms of how education policy reform can tackle knife crime. The first is changes to school funding. So a lot of listeners will be aware of the pupil premium. This is money that schools, colleges and alternative provision settings right across England receive to spend on disadvantaged children. And they're asked to spend it on disadvantaged children to improve their attainment. And the government and the Department of Education have recognised that often a child's attainment can be impacted by violence. It can be impacted by their fear of violence. We know that 10% of children skip school because they're worried about violence. And so, the DfE have recognised that, and they put out new guidance to schools in March that said, look, you don't have to, but if you're really worried about this, you can spend some of your pupil premium money on evidence-based violence reduction interventions like mentoring, like social emotional skill development, like therapeutic support. And there's a really good example there of providing schools with, the resource and the nudge to say, yeah, if you're worried about this is an issue for your school, here's some resource to spend on it, which is fantastic to see. The other sort of really exciting reform is the curriculum. So from September of this year, September 2026, the RSHE curriculum is changing. So secondary school children, every secondary age child in England from this September will learn that knife carrying is not common. They will learn how to spot the warning signs in a relationship, so that hopefully it doesn't end in violence. They'll learn the social and emotional skills you need to avoid conflict, to communicate better with people, to de-escalate situations. And again, a really good example of an education policy change that on the face of it, people wouldn't say changing the curriculum is the key thing that you should do, or people wouldn't say school funding is the key thing you should do to prevent knife crime. But alongside policing and enforcement changes, it can really make sure we have a whole society, a multi-sector approach to tackling a really challenging problem like knife crime.
A lot of people across England and Wales, where our work is based, will have seen that there have been a number of shocking high-profile stabbings across the last couple of years as the government has been trying to achieve this mission of theirs. And it makes it easy to assume that everything's always getting worse. There's a lot of fear-mongering in the media. There's a lot of talk about young people being antisocial in public, rises in school exclusions, and you know, huge incidents that have caused rioting and other types of, you know, really disruptive events in this country's history just over the last couple of years. So it's easy to sort of make the assumption that everything is always getting worse. But actually, knife crime specifically seems to be falling in a way that we might not have seen in about 20 years. And that's especially true amongst young people. So between March 2024 and March 2025, hospital admissions for knife assault fell by 20%, and knife-enabled homicides fell by 53% for under 18s. These are big numbers. These are big falls. Are we able to get hopeful about things travelling in the right direction? Are we getting better at preventing violence?
Yeah, so I think there's room for cautious optimism with a couple of caveats. I think it's right to say that there's certainly some progress, and particularly, as you say, since the start of this parliament, knife crime is down, knife homicides are down, hospital admissions are down. There's been a particularly sharp fall in knife-enabled homicides amongst under 18s, which, you know, as the Youth Endowment Fund, that's our mission. That's fantastic to see. But there are a couple of caveats. The first is, you know, it sounds trite and sounds obvious. One case of violence, one case of a child becoming involved in violence is too many. And so, you know, we shouldn't get complacent and say, great, fantastic, job done, it's moving in the right direction. There are still far too many cases. Now, that's not to say that children should be worried about it. It's not to say children should be carrying knives. They shouldn't. So, you know, we always need to make sure we're not creating this climate of fear. But the first caveat is to say, yeah, one case of violence is too many and we should not be complacent. The second is, yes, knife crime as a whole is falling, but there are specific types of knife crime that are rising. And one that we should be particularly worried and concerned about is violence against women and girls. So if you look at the period from 2019 to 2025, homicides involving a knife, so all homicides involving a knife, fell by nearly a quarter. That's great. Fantastic. In the same period, the same 6-year period, indecent and sexual assault using a knife rose by nearly a third, and rape using a knife rose by almost half. So here's a specific subset of knife crime, violence against women and girls, that's actually going up while the totality of knife crime is coming down. There's why it's, you know, it's brilliant to see that the government has also published a violence against women and girls strategy, and they need to make sure they're redoubling their efforts there in addition to their efforts on knife crime, because clearly that is an area of violence that we must tackle.
That speaks to how having strategies like this in a government that allows them to be able to really like focus and be held accountable to problems like this can serve a purpose of driving change. What else should the government be doing?
I think there are 3 things the government should do now. The first is, it sounds boring, implement the plan that you've got. There's lots of brilliant things, brilliant evidence-based things within the Knife Crime Action Plan that was published in April. You know, whether that's make sure you deliver the Young Futures hubs, make sure, you know, you build and refurbish the 250 youth clubs across the country that you've committed to. Make sure you'll provide that better support for suspended and excluded children that has been committed to. Make sure there's, you know, that investment in diversion, that there's the reform of the youth justice system, there's better support for children in custody, right? There's lots of evidence-based interventions in the plan that we think are great, and the evidence shows can reduce children's involvement in violence and knife crime. We now just need to make sure they happen and they're delivered. So number one, implement the plan that you've got, because it's a good plan, and let's make sure that we see it through. The second is to continue to think about violence as a multi-sector problem, as a problem that all of society needs to tackle, not just the Home Office. As I've said, the Home Office plays a really key role, but so does, for instance, the health department. You know, there's lots of brilliant stuff in the plan around therapy and around making sure that mental health support teams in schools are delivering high quality support to children. We know, and it's quite a prominent strand of our toolkit, which is the summary of the best available international evidence on violence reduction, delivering cognitive behavioural therapy to children at risk of involvement in violence reduces their risk of involvement in crime by 27%. And again, if you said to people, CBT is the answer to knife crime, it might not be the first thing that comes to mind. But here is a health intervention that if you can deliver it to highly vulnerable children, it can reduce their vulnerability, reduce their risk of involvement in crime. So let's keep on approaching this as a problem that requires different sectors and different departments to feed in. The final point I'll make that the government needs to do, I've already mentioned, not just focus on knife crime. Violence against women and girls needs to continue to be a key priority for government. And yes, we're starting to see the dial move in the right direction on knife crime. We're not yet seeing that for violence against women and girls, and so we need to focus on that.
Joe, I think we'll leave it there. Thanks so much for joining me today.
Thanks, Ciaran.
If you want to find out more about the Youth Endowment Fund, hit subscribe and head to our website.